Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today to participate in this webinar. My name is Glynis Jackson, and I'm the Capacity Building Manager at the SASDC. Let's get into our topic for today. The Sustainable Development Goals, known as SDGs, also known as Global Goals, were adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. They address the global challenges we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace, and justice. As a global blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all, these goals also provide a compelling framework for integrating supplier diversity into corporate strategy in support of promoting prosperity while protecting the planet. Many of the sustainability challenges faced by companies have their genesis in the operating practices of subcontractors and suppliers, whether this relates to material content, labor practices, or impact on communities and habitats. This online panel discussion features global participants offering a diversity of perspectives on supplier-related issues that impact on supply chains, contributing towards the UN Sustainability Development Goals. They will share current global corporate procurement sustainability strategies and practices, how organizational culture and leadership development can enable corporate and specifically supply chain sustainability responses, and what is needed to adapt existing supply chains to incorporate sustainability beyond just the environmental perspective. I would like to hand over to our moderator this afternoon, Gary Joseph, CEO of the SASDC. Thank you.
Thank you, Glynis, and welcome to everybody. The purpose of today's session actually is the first step in a journey that we will be embarking upon as the SASDC, looking at how, as an organization, we are able to support the process of promoting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals through the work that we do, supporting our corporates and supporting our ecosystem of Black-owned businesses that we work with on a day-to-day basis to work together towards achieving that vision that we have as a globe, as participants within the international arena. From the side of the SASDC, the strategic fit that we see links directly to the way in which we operate as an organization. Our mission is encapsulated by our 5C models, and our 5C model and areas of focus is, as you can see on the screen, the first C is that of collaborate, creating platforms through which we can collaborate in pursuit of common supply diversity goals and outcomes, bringing together different stakeholders as we do that. The second is that of certify, where we certify Black businesses who are part of our ecosystem to become part of the ecosystem, and then linking to our third C, connect them to corporate procurement opportunities that will enable them to participate more effectively within the mainstream economy, and through doing that, enhance the economy as a whole. But this is a journey that we are on, and our fourth C is that of capacitate, where we look at building the capacity of both our corporates and representatives within our corporate base on how to implement supply diversity best practice in order to ensure that the type of supply diversity outcomes that we are looking for addresses the issues of poverty, inequality, as well as high levels of unemployment that we have in the country. And of course, true to being African, as an organization, we celebrate success. And when we look at the way in which supply chains have become complex and interconnected, we do believe that this aligns to our mission as the SASDC. Firstly, there's a need for more collaboration because it's a collective effort. There's a need to capacitate and enable supply chain practitioners suppliers within the ecosystem to adapt and pivot their businesses in response to their value offerings, matching the goals and objectives that corporates have to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. And then, of course, connecting them to each other for better performance and sustainability. Over time, there's also become an increasing focus on certification standards associated with sustainability, as corporations want to ensure that they are selecting suppliers with whom they partner that can contribute towards their sustainability goals and objectives through their supply chains. And we can only celebrate when we deliver on profit, people, and planet, and not each in separate compartments and in isolation from each other. So supply diversity enhances the resilience and the sustainability and forms part of adaptive supply chains. Technically speaking, to the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, within the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals stable. And it assists to improve the overall competitive advantage of companies and adds to the overall bottom line of these companies that exercise this. So more and more multiple multi-stakeholder partnerships that we see unfolding within the whole environment when it comes to sustainability is taking place, and collaboration across supply chains and through supply chains is becoming increasingly important because everybody is pursuing the shared value opportunities that comes along with issues of sustainability. The critical momentum of such activities creates an opportunity for such share value to be created. And we believe as the SASDC that we have a role to play to contribute towards enhancing that momentum of activity and for unlocking those opportunities beyond those players that are just within existing mainstream economy supply chains, but also emerging Black businesses that want to participate within that space. Today, we are joined by 3 panelists coming from different parts of the world. We have Mr. Craig Reed, who is from Corteva Agri-Science, Mr. Indrasen Naidoo, the managing partner of Integral Supply Chain Network, Supply Network Advisory, and Dr. Maja Stanojevic. Sorry, I apologize to her up front already about her surname and my inability to pronounce it correctly. Sorry about that once again, Maja. And the goal of today is to draw on all of the expertise and the experiences that they have relevant to their respective organizations as they share their views in response to a couple of questions that I've prepared in advance that I think is of relevance to this conversation today. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is to proceed in introducing members of my panel. And I'll start off firstly with our first panelist. Thank you for joining us, Craig. Mr. Craig Reed.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Really happy to be here with you today. As mentioned, my name is Craig Reed. I'm the Chief Procurement Officer for Corteva Agri-Science, born out of the merger of DuPont. Around in over 140, 50 plus countries in the areas of seed, crop protection, and digital ag products. I have responsibility for the team globally that has responsibility for sourcing, as well as for facility services and corporate real estate. For our company, this topic is extremely important. We just this year posted our sustainability goals and are well on our way in terms of driving strategies against the achievement of all of those opportunities from an organizational standpoint. I've been in the procurement space for over 25 years across several industries, and am a part of several organizations, including a board member with SASDC, NMSDC. I'm a board of trustee for Florida A&M University, which in the United States is a historically Black college and university, here as well, which is also my alma mater. And I have an MBA with the concentration in supply chain management from Arizona State University. So very happy to be with you today and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Craig. I'd like to now introduce my second panelist, Mr. Indrasen Naidoo. Indrasen and I come a long way, and it's actually through recent engagements that we've been having that has culminated in us having this event where we've been talking around the issue of sustainable supply chain, which is an area that Indrasen is very involved in. And he's been helping us to shape and better understand the Sustainable Development Goals and how it relates to us as an organization. And they has also graciously offered his time to assist us going forward with better shaping our strategy on how we respond to it. So I'd like to introduce Indrasen. I know that he's having challenges with regards to connectivity. Indrasen, over to you.
Good evening and good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel and contributing to the SASDC. You know, as a founder director of the SASDC, there's deep passion in my heart for all the good work that you guys are doing. In terms of my focus and that of integral supply networks, we position ourselves as coaches for supply chain performance and sustainability. And I suppose the first question that comes to mind is why coaching? Well, essentially our view is that organizations, like Craig has described, employ very clever and capable people, working hard at what they do. And often people like ourselves from outside the system really can help contribute and shape conversations, build relationships through a coaching modality rather than being a bunch of experts. And the three principles on which we build our business is very much a people-centric focus, number one. Our view is that it's people first in terms of mindsets, beliefs, values, and assumptions. Secondly, we take a systems thinking view where we believe that synthesis, looking at the whole, and analysis, looking at the parts, are very much a dual view in how to navigate supply chain complexity, supply chain resilience, the things that you mentioned in the introduction, Gary. So we at the heart of our thinking, use systems thinking. And then the third principle is one of practitioner-led adaptation. I myself, like Craig, have been a supply chain practitioner. Most of my career was in South Africa, across multiple industries. So that practical leader experience is what we bring to our service offering as integral supply networks, because it's really about adapting practices and introducing new, but not creating practices in supply chain for sustainability that are running in parallel or at the exclusion of existing process. So that's in a nutshell is what we focus on, integral supply networks. And once again, it's really a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Indrasen. My third panelist is Dr. Maja.
Good morning, good day, and good evening to everyone wherever you are. It's a pleasure to join in this conversation, and it's just quite amazing that we do have these sustainability goals and that world is focusing on such worthy goals. Besides kind of, you mentioned earlier, the profit, people and planet, which I kind of like to reverse: planet, people, profit, because if there was no planet, be no people, and the profit, who cares? So I think it's quite amazing that we are having this kind of conversations, and this is kind of audience that is interested rather than just the activists. I'm representing here Institute for Developmental Coaching that in a way is focused on bringing the awareness of a particular perspective to leadership development, which is what we call the vertical to complement the horizontal perspective. And it's focused on both developing leaders and organizations, as well as training coaches and consultants to be able to understand and use adult development perspective in their work with leaders and organizations. I would love to contribute in any way, shape as possible to this conversation, but I'm going to be coming from that perspective to see where do individual leader within their capacity, as well as the collective leadership, so collectives of people, how capable they are of actually really engaging with this kind of sustainability goals that we are talking about. And I'm just looking forward to this conversation, so whatever comes through. One thing that I'd like to actually mention is that I have a very fond relationship with South Africa, that I lived there from 92 to 2000, and it was such a huge blessing to basically be there at that time, because coming from Bosnia and ex-Yugoslavia, where my country has fallen apart due to very ineffective and unwise leadership, to be in South Africa during the leadership election and leadership of Nelson Mandela has been incredibly healing, both personally, as well as it helped me to see how the maturity of the leader is actually the most important thing, rather than all the other factors, that if you have a mature and effective leader, that almost impossible is possible. And unfortunately, the vice versa is the case as well. So I thank South Africa and all South Africans for being part of the healing of my soul, as well as giving me the calling in a career for the second part of my life. So that's it from me.
Thanks, Maja. There's a couple of themes that we will be exploring in our conversations today to the members of the panelists. The first theme that I want to focus the panelists' attention to is on why are the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as going alongside that and in support of it, supply chain sustainability. Why is it important? If we have a look, that supply chains continue to be one of the most important levers for businesses to create positive impact of the world, with an estimated 80% of global trade passing through supply chains. At the same time, such supply chains can also create societal and environmental burdens. We've seen that in many cases on the news, particularly the type of disastrous impact that environmental challenges have been created through the production processes in the oil and gas industry, etc. So when we look at drastic actions are required to mitigate such effects. And supply chains are now expected to be responsible and sustainable, where responsibility and sustainability are understood in a broad sense. And this responsibility and sustainability comes in the area of addressing economic, political, societal, human rights, legal, ethical, environmental concerns. So the supply chain is no longer just about buying goods and services and expediting that into the business. It's really become much more focused on the holistic impact that supply chains are having. So by implementing supply chain sustainability programs, companies engage with both direct and sub-tier suppliers, mainstreaming their values and actions, and actually maximizing overall social, environmental, and ethical impacts. And we see that as what in the spirit is attempted to be addressed as part of the BBBE legislation that we have in our country. By working together, buyers and suppliers in global supply chains and networks can advance human rights issues such as labor rights, can ensure climate resilience and negative mitigation of the negative impacts on climate change, environmental protection, but more importantly for me, inclusive economic growth and ethical business practices. I'd like to pose the first question to Craig. I read the following statement on your company website. Just to open the statement, it says, "We're in it for good, a mission with purpose." How is the Sustainable Development Goals relevant to Corteva AgriScience as an organization, a company, multinational, relatively new and fresh? And more specifically, how does this impact on the supply chain that you find yourself responsible for?
Thank you very much for that question. And also, just in terms of, and also as it relates to thinking through, the relevancy of the SDGs to our company. For us, it's extremely important. As the largest pure play ag company, the SDGs are relevant for us in so many different ways. If I kind of think about the highlights of the SDGs, we look at many of them and their relevancy for our organization. For example, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 12, and 17 are very relevant. But for us also, we're looking at 2, 6, 13, and 15 as a part of our overall goals. So as a company, we're very committed to advancing sustainability, agriculture, and it's really in our purpose statement. Our purpose statement as a company is to enrich the lives of those who produce and those who consume, ensuring progress for generations to come. And when you think about that as a purpose statement, in order to deliver on that, it means we have to walk hand in hand with the requirements of ensuring a sustainable company. And when we think about sustainability from the context of supply chain, it's extremely important. As you mentioned, the impact of the supply chain, the overall products that we produce, that supports the services that we supply on behalf of our companies are extremely important. It's an integral part of how we operate as an organization. And if I take a look at 2 examples from our company, we have a significant goal about new products that we're developing as an organization. And every new product that we develop will be assessed from concept to inception throughout its development to ensure that it meets baseline requirements that advances it at least one sustainable innovation criteria and maintains that level throughout its entire life cycle. So when you think about supply chain, you think about products, you can think about the entire life cycle. And from a supply chain perspective, it's extremely important. And so this tagline that we've used, which is "in it for good," is really a shortened way of us being able to espouse our purpose statement, which is really about generations to come. And when we think about our impact from a supply chain perspective and the things that we produce on behalf of the organization, it's extremely important, especially from a metric standpoint and the things that we're driving there as well. We also think about new product sustainability and what that means in the organization as we develop new products, and what that means from a supply-based perspective, and ensuring that our suppliers also have that as a part of their process, because in order for us to take that journey, our suppliers have to take that journey along with us. And my role as Chief Procurement Officer in the company is to ensure that as we're developing and putting in place our category, commodity strategies, and we're looking at the best suppliers that can produce products on behalf of our company to deliver on those services, is that it's in alignment with that purpose statement, that very simple statement of "in it for good," which is all about enriching the lives. And as a company, we've linked it all back to the SDGs, so that it becomes very global, very purposeful, and it's easy to understand in terms of what we're driving as an organization.
Thanks, Craig. And I think the African agenda is an important one probably for Corteva, because issues of food security and the impact that climate change is having on food security within the context of Africa is probably at the forefront of all of the R&D and the associated supply chain impacts for you guys. Thanks a lot for that. I'd like to pose a different question to Indrasen. And that question relates to the fact that, things go wrong. When supply chains go wrong, and they don't take into consideration these triple bottom line issues of environmental, social, and governance performance when it comes to suppliers, companies often leave themselves open to significant operational and reputational risks. Indrasen, in your experience, how well is this concept understood? And how are supply chain leaders responding to this issue? We're hearing how Craig has taken the gauntlet and he's responding to it as part of his responsibility. What is your experience with others?
So to your question, I think I'd like to start off by just examining when things go wrong. And I think when you look at the way supply chains are set up, if they are set up for economic performance motives, generally wrong is seen as some level of economic performance going wrong. But I think there's a bigger agenda in terms of going wrong when you look at it through the ESG lens. In terms of going wrong, I think there we need to look at social license to operate and building social capital. And as humans, we tend to respond better to things that are immediate and more threat response than we are to things that are slow burning and require a longer kind of perspective. So there, I think to answer your question in terms of understanding, I think the understanding is growing. We heard a very mature and advanced view from Craig. There are similar other companies like Unilever that year on year show and demonstrate leadership in supply chain sustainability. And Patagonia, BP for the energy company are also so there's pockets in countries, in geographies, and in industries that show advanced leadership similar to what Craig has demonstrated. And most importantly, these companies, like Craig has shared with us, have this integrated with their business strategy. So I think that's the first important response, is that there's a clear leadership statement and it's integrated with business strategy. In terms of other responses, I think the responses, when you look at it from an ESG lens, there are companies increasingly starting to progress along the lines of integrated reporting. Granted, there are few, but integrated reporting is becoming more prominent. Almost 60, 70, 80% of stock exchange listed companies have sustainability reporting. Whilst they don't have integrated reporting, they have sustainability reporting. So that's a very good response in terms of sharing greater information on what companies are doing, be it on greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, 3, on social procurement, on ethical procurement. So there's a big response and a sharing and increased transparency. Importantly, when we look at it through the eyes of an investor, one of the responses we're seeing from the investor community relates to responsible investment. And I think this role of the investment community or investor community is certainly a catalyst and a motivator for organizations to want to advance their agenda on sustainability. If you look at the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, it's once again a motivator to companies to get onto the sustainability development goals as part of their business strategy. No doubt, black swan events like COVID are a reminder to us how connected we are and interdependent we are. So that serves as a catalyst to remind us that things we may think as slow burn are actually more immediate than we'd like to think. So yeah, Gary, hopefully that serves as some level of response to your question.
Yes, thank you, Indrasen. And one thing what it highlights is that we cannot afford to get it wrong. And there's a recognition on the part and a proactive position that is being adopted, especially within in multinational companies, to ensure from a supply chain leadership perspective that you don't get it wrong, and to do as much to avoid that being the case. But if we look at supplier-related governance issues, they remain the main obstacle towards the United Nations Global Compact sustainable supply chain practices, and then followed by implementing strategy across business function. The third element linked to the importance of addressing sustainability is around leadership support, and in certain cases the lack thereof, and therefore the way in which it becomes an obstacle for progress. And this has been the case within the United Nations Global Compact Progress Report of 2019 that focuses at a country level as well as an organizational level when it comes to reporting. Maya, I'd like to pose the following question to you. What are your thoughts on the relationship between leadership and inter-organizational collaboration, and how the issue of implementing sustainability strategies within companies is affected by the culture and the leadership dynamics within the organization itself?
Well, it's as direct as it can be, the correlation, that basically the effective leadership is going to drive effective performance. And the reason why the vertical perspective is important here, that there are particular capacities of leadership that are required in order to deliver on some of the aspects of what the Sustainable Development Goals are asking for. So if there is no effective leadership to drive them, it's not going to happen. And sometimes what happens, they are set from as Indrasen and Craig mentioned, from a very mature leadership perspective. Now, the implementation of that is going to depend. Is there a receptivity, is there understanding and then ability to match and drive those developmental goals? You know, people still do think profit, people, planet. And if profit is number one, people say, yes, I want to do that. We need to do these things. But capacity to do it as well as it is required may not always be there. So the fact that someone says that they can do it and can they really do it is very much dependent on their stage of development. So I think I'm in some way going to answer this probably later when it is having some time to understand these stages of human development, because in some way there is a necessary to have a capacity of thinking, feeling, and acting in a world that can deliver on majority of these goals. So if people are not capable of doing what they want to do, they're gonna talk the talk, but they're not gonna walk the talk. So one of the challenges that actually even that mature leadership has is sometimes to actually think and look through the world, what are the governmental and country stages of development, and are they able or not to actively deliver on that? And if they are not, what kind of support they can be given in order to do so, or how to look for those shiny lights, like listening to Craig has been amazing to hear actually that the company really is thinking and driving that kind of agenda. And so being able in those countries who are still basically in most of the need to have these goals met, the leadership in those countries may not necessarily always be at the level that can actively engage, because they usually are still what's in it for me and what's in it for us, rather than what's in it for the larger whole. So sometimes those are the challenges. So basically having effective individual and collective leadership is what is the most important thing in order to be able to deliver on that. And yes, some of the things that both Indrasen and Craig have already mentioned is because investment that is going to be either given or withheld is going to stimulate that, because people will see that, oh, in order to get what we want, which is mostly profit, we need to do this. And then there is going to be a gap, unfortunately, that it's not something as quick. It's not just, I want this and it's there. It will take time to develop individual and collective leaders to be able to grow into the ability to truly, from their heart, engage, as well as from the capacity of the thinking that is required for these interdependencies in collaboration so that they can be actually engaged and delivered on.
Thanks, Maja. So what you're saying is that the top is a top-down and a bottom-up approach is important, but there's a need for more thinking on the WIFU, the what's in it for us, than the WIFM, the what's in it for me. And through that type of leadership, you end up thinking beyond just what is within line of sight within your own organization, but rather how your own organization can both positively and negatively impact on the environment in which it operates. Now, thanks for that. So I'm unashamedly biased when it comes to the issue of supplier diversity because I head up a supplier diversity organization, and for the past 15 years, this is what I've been involved in. So I want to ask Craig the question. How do you see the supply diversity fitting into the sustainability agenda of Corteva? And I must say that, you know, very often companies drive these initiatives in isolation from each other. In your opinion, do you find that this focus on the sustainable development goals, that it assists you with the process of pushing the supply diversity agenda to drive a more inclusive supply chain, not just in the US, but across Corteva Agri-Sciences supply chain across the world?
Well, thank you for that question, and really appreciate both the comments from Indrasen and from Maja as well. Just to give you a little more insight about Corteva, you know, as I mentioned, you know, we're the product of two very large, very old multinational global entities, Dow and DuPont. So, but a relatively new company. So it's we celebrated our 1-year anniversary June of this year as Corteva Agri-Science. And we started out really very simply with what's the purpose of the organization. And we've been developing and facilitating processes from then. So as I mentioned, we deployed on our anniversary, our sustainability goals that have essentially 14 initiatives that we're driving as a company, broken out across 4 areas. Really, it's wrapped around farmers, land, community, and operations. From a supplier diversity and supplier sustainability perspective, I had the opportunity in the development of our organization, my team, to really approach this topic differently. And our decision was to look at them holistically. In order to have a sustainable supply base, you need to have a diverse supply base. And in order to have a diverse supply base, you need to have a sustainable supply base. And so I have a leader in my organization, Michelle Morin, who has responsibility for both supplier diversity and sustainability. So we've actually integrated both of those together. And as a part of the company's sustainability goals that I've called out, we've actually embedded requirements for supply diversity as a part of the company's sustainability goals. And so this really gets after SDG 5 and SDG 10 in terms of the things that we're looking at. As Maja mentioned, top down is extremely important. So in the wake of everything that's happening around the world, we have the global pandemic, we have global social unrest, and a whole host of other issues that are taking place. Our company and our CEO has taken the opportunity to stand up an inclusion, diversity, and equity team that's comprised of senior leaders across this organization that are really looking at collectively, how do we continue to advance the company's agenda in those 3 very important areas, linked back to our sustainability strategies, but also linked back to the company's strategy and overall company's purpose. As an example, for us, embedded in our overall company's goals, we have a goal that says by 2030, we'll have 25% of our global addressable procurement spend with diverse and small businesses. And for us, this is a global goal. So we don't look at it in the context of where our home base is, North America. Michelle, in her responsibility, has the goal of doing this where Corteva does business around the world. And in South Africa, happy to say we have a leader that's very partnered with Michelle Taryn Govinder, who's a strategic a part of helping us to build our strategy for the South Africa region in terms of what we will be doing there to ensure that we're meeting those goals head on as an organization. So really, really excited about that work. So for my entire global team, we're running a cross-functional network of leaders that have taken on the responsibility of helping us to establish the strategy, the goals, metrics that we'll be deploying as we've continued to now take a look at how do we execute against delivering this overall goal. So I would say that looking at it as an integrated portion of you being able to deliver the business's purpose and the overall strategy is extremely important. So getting at the what's in it for me or what's in it for them, it's really a part of what's going to deliver the overall business strategy, and having it embedded as a part of that overall process really helps to drive inertia, strategy, and a single focus across the company of how do you really go after delivering on some big audacious goals for the company in the long term.
Thanks, Craig. I've had the privilege of also meeting and interacting with Michelle. So you've got a valuable asset in your team there, and she's very driven to ensure that these sustainability and supply diversity goals are entrenched within the organization, and how she, within her role, is able to support the delivery of those outcomes. She's also not one that goes just for achieving targets. She's always wanting to exceed those targets, so a valuable asset. But what I like about what you're saying is it's leading me to the second theme that I want to pose a couple of questions on to the members of the panel, and that is around principles and practices. Because it's all good to talk, but you've got to walk the walk as well. So when we look today, to be successful supply chain managers, they must be increasingly thinking about short-term financial considerations and building relationships that can deliver long-term value along the entire supply chain. So this includes incorporating sustainability issues into the company's sourcing and purchasing practices. So the field has grown over time, and leading companies have increasingly recognized that sustainability programs do more than just deflect negative stakeholder attention. They also drive value to the business through supply chain sustainability, and there's a business case for doing it. So I'd like to start off with Indrasen as a practitioner over there. With a biased, once again, focus on supply diversity, what would you describe as the main supply chain sustainability principles that best underpin and support an effective inclusive procurement practice with companies that drive these SDGs? And what is the business case for supply chain sustainability alongside that? Craig's alluded to how it fits into Corteva, but from your experience, what do you see and what do you observe around those issues?
Thank you, Gary. So firstly, let me acknowledge Craig and his team for the words that he shared. If you look at some of the key things that he highlighted, integration, alignment, cross-functional, local and global practice being in alignment. I mean, those are really all practices that, as you heard, are very much prevalent in Craig's world, and I think very relevant. And one of the reasons I would say it's very relevant is that one should consider supply chain sustainability to be a combination of traditional supply chain management plus corporate social responsibility amalgamated. And if one looks at that, once again, we are now at the social license to operate spectrum. And if we talk of business case, communities and social license to operate, social capital are at the heart of your business case. And also when we look at a business case, I think we should always think of business case together with a case for change. And the case for change is overwhelming, as we've heard and will continue to hear from various quarters. The other element, I think, in terms of the business case and in terms of specifically supplier diversity, is the principle I shared earlier on about looking at it human systems first. We've got to remind ourselves that the concept of a supply chain was created by some human who thought about it. The supply chain is defined by humans. In the absence of humans being the customer, there is no supply chain. So diversity and inclusion has to be part of the fabric of thinking if one wants to recognize that a supply chain begins with the customer, ends with the customer. And the consumer is once again profiled as cross-sectional, diverse, and gender, in terms of gender as well. So I think all of these factors have an inherent flow towards diversity, notwithstanding many of the sustainability development goals being explicit in their gender or other diversity principles. So, you know, I think it's very self-evident that diversity and practices towards diversity are enshrined in the very essence of the sustainability development goals.
Thanks, Indrasen. I'd like to now cross over to Maja. So Maya's out close in Sydney, so it's quite late at night there. So I appreciate the fact that she's been able to join us here. So I've heard you speak earlier about the issue of vertical development and leadership capacity, and then also around the fact that this is a core offering of the organization that you have established. And it revolves around the theory of leadership maturity, a leadership maturity framework, and associated with that to bring life to it is developmental coaching training. That's a flagship offering of your organization. At the SASDC, like I mentioned earlier, we speak about the 5 C's. Can you tell us a little bit more about your leadership maturity framework, but also how you see this linking to vertical development and leadership capacity to support the sustainability agenda, and particularly sustainable supply chain when it comes to the discipline and the practitioners within that discipline?
So coming back to the, you know, sometimes it's difficult to talk about this when people do not have the concept. So I'm just give a little bit of the background. So leadership maturity framework is basically exploring the human potential to grow, and how with its growth, it's thinking, its feeling, and its actions to greater and greater capacity, to deeper understanding and greater wisdom. So the reason why this theory, that it has been there for a while, but it became very relevant and of interest to many businesses and leaders, was because we realized that we didn't have what it takes to actually meet the challenges that we have. And we have often heard, and the quote that often is contributed to Einstein, that we cannot solve the problems from the level of consciousness from which we have created it, but we need to evolve in order to be able to see them from a different, higher, greater perspective in order then to address that. So this particular theory is looking at what are those stages of development that we as humans go through and how they impact leadership, both again, individual and collective. So the stages that it describes, that each stage has its capacities, has its strengths, and it has its limitations. And where world is at large, is in kind of in the middle, in the center of this developmental tangent that has 9 stages that are described. So we are somewhere that basically are right now experiencing this, what it's called the liminal state, in which whatever we have done to do well, to grow well, is actually creating the problems which we are experiencing now when it comes to climate change and the difficulties for which we are now looking what are the solutions that we can developed that are much more inclusive than they have been. If you look historically, how we have led businesses or the governments. Now we really can see the interdependencies, that we are all connected and interconnected. And unfortunately, we see that now through the negative ways because of the COVID situation. We can see how it happens, that those interdependencies. And for the same reason, we need to, on a global level, be able to truly collaborate with each other to create the solutions for the betterment of the basically sustaining life. The sustainability, when we're looking at that, is how do we sustain life on this planet through the practices that will remain possible for the humankind to remain, and how to evolve economy to be as such that rather than overusing and expanding and already limited resources, how can you do that in a sustainable way? Looking at these stages and why it's relevant to actually develop leader and leadership is that with each stage there is a perspective that is particularly linked to ability to see in space and time. And the earlier stages, which we call conventional, they're very much in here and now. And if it is, it's maybe within 3 to 6 months, year at most, and then where most of the world is basically looking at a 5-year span. In order to think sustainably, you have to be able to be in these later stages, which we call post-conventional stages, that actually have the ability to think in more than 10 years and multi-generational. Because one of the things that Craig has mentioned is that, what is it for the future generations? How do we meet our own needs, but actually in such a way that still is taking care of the future generations? Now, that is the thinking that comes with the capacity of the later, more post-conventional leadership. And that is exactly what we need today in order to survive and thrive in the future. So developmental coaching is there to actually help identify where is it that individual and collective leadership is at, and what are the different practices and the tools that are necessary to help them evolve to be able to meet the challenges of the current world. We hear often that look at the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and we hear that we need to collaborate and we need to be agile and we need to be able to work in a more strategic way. But currently it is about 80% of the population, which includes the leadership population, that does not really have a capacity to do so. Only 20% does. So we need to work really quite vigorously on developing the leadership capacity in organizations and in governmental institutions to be able to effectively meet the challenges of today's world and be able to develop on these sustainability goals that we are talking about. So you have collaborate, capacitate, connect, and celebrate, and all of those components actually very much have in themselves that implicit developmental perspective. So to be able to truly collaborate and to truly connect with whom are you collaborating, connecting? Just with those who are like you from your region, or with multiple, with a vast diversity that is both in colors, in age, in cultures, in species, so to speak. Is the more you can do, the greater leadership maturity person will exhibit. So, and when we celebrate that, we celebrate, the life, rather just success of profitability or success of one company, that we actually celebrate our ability to see and sustain life for all. So that is like the greater big celebration party that we'd like to join, hopefully very soon.
Thanks, Maja. I think you'll be back in Africa soon, because we in Africa, we know how to party and celebrate. It's really around that visionary leadership that under conventional management practices over time that has developed. But it's this visionary leadership that goes beyond just the visionary leadership to mobilize others, but that understanding of bigger picture issues that are coming along 10, 15 years down the line, and being able to incorporate that way of thinking into strategy and in driving cultural change within the organization. I think that's crucial in that regard. And it seems to be the case, Craig, that you've got elements of that already within Corteva. You've outlined to us some of the adaptations that you've implemented with members of your team to support issues of supply chain sustainability, and how you're aligning your supply chain practices and your procurement to the Sustainable Development Goals. If I can ask you just to highlight two key principles that if anybody were to observe what you are doing as a company, those two key principles for sustainability that you visibly drive as part of the strategy that you are responsible for.
Thanks, Gary. I think we just take a look at two key things that we're driving, and I'll look at them as I mentioned, because I think it's so extremely important to make sure you understand the linkage. So as a company, we've said, here are the four areas that we're focused on. You started out the conversation with our tagline, "In it for good." That's actually the end of the statement, right? It starts with in it for farmers, in it for the land, in it for communities, and in it for our operations. And then it's in it for good. From a procurement perspective, one of the ways that I am driving our role and responsibility to be able to develop and integrate into this work is that we as a function were a part of helping to develop the sub-strategies that support the enablement of the vision around in it for farming, as an example, in it for good, or in it for operations. And as a result, we have goals that we have responsibility for as a function that we're driving in support of delivering and enabling those goals. To make it more tangible from an organizational structure perspective, I am a part of the business operations leadership team, which is the president, which is a combination of the presidents of all the businesses that have responsibility for seed production, crop protection production, and our digital technology that essentially are the tools and services that we're developing, the goods and services we're developing on behalf of our farmers. I sit directly with that team. That team's strategy is no different from my strategy. My strategy is all aligned with how do we enable the overall business strategy, which means that business strategy is also aligned to the company's sustainability strategy. So if I'm embedded in the business platform strategies and also embedded in the sustainability strategy, then the strategies that we have to deliver as a function aren't just procurement's goals, it's the company's goals. So supplier diversity strategies that I talked about before, in terms of having 25% of our supply base with small and diverse suppliers by the year 2030, isn't just a procurement goal. So this is something that I drive exclusively as a procurement leader. It's the company's goals that now I have a portion of responsibility to deliver, along with my peers that sit with me that have now adopted this as the strategy for us to be able to deliver on the company's overall purpose of ensuring progress for generations to come. So from a principle standpoint, it isn't about what's my strategy, it's about the company's strategy, ensuring that the work that we're doing is in alignment to it and that it's embedded and everyone has ownership and responsibility for it. From a global perspective, with the way that we're set up and arranged, that isn't just a strategy that affects how we do business as a company in a specific region, how we do business on an integrated basis. I love the comment that Maja mentioned in terms of how we've been able to understand that the world, for all intents and purposes, is very interconnected. And when you think about supply chains, there's no truer scenario vision of the interconnectedness than when you start to think about the supply chains. As an example, earlier this year, when the pandemic first arose, we needed as a function to procure product to protect our employees who are essential around the world. And so we needed to get product into regions where it was extremely tough because they had restrictions on being able to procure product or move product. And because of the global nature of our supply chain and the smarts of our leaders, for example, in South Africa, Taryn Govinder, who I spoke of earlier, had the responsibility of helping us to acquire product based on the relationships between South Africa and China, that we could actually leverage that interconnectedness, leverage that relationship to be able to support supply around the world coming from that region. With that interconnectedness, it brings about the opportunities for us to be able to leverage where we buy, how we buy, not just for the regions where we're doing business, but on a global basis from a company perspective. So hence, when we talk about supplier sustainability and supplier diversity on a global nature, we don't think about it in the context of you supplying in a region, but it's you being able to supply across the entire global supply chain, which opens up opportunities for us to think very differently in terms of how we provide opportunities that allow us to meet the overall goals that we've set for ourselves, that allow us to be in it for good.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And of course, everything happens smoothly when everybody's aligned to it. But we all also understand that there are barriers and risks, which is the third theme that I'd like to just delve into as part of today's conversation. I'm going to shake it up a bit here and ask, as a follow-up to what you've said, and if you could just very briefly tell us, what do you see as the main supplier-related barriers that ends up constraining your efforts to optimally drive sustainability within the supply chains? Where I'm coming from with regards to this is that normally what happens, any pressures that are exerted within the business, whether it's pressures from within or external pressures, finds its way to the supply chain. And the supply chain then passes that on to suppliers that it directly engages with. So it's this chain of events where there's issues, and the same thing applies to barriers. So in your experience, what are the main supply-related barriers that constrain your efforts to achieve these sustainability goals?
Yeah, first, as I would say, the biggest becomes the significant continuous change in business strategy, right? Because you're enabling the business, it's extremely important to make sure you're meeting the requirements of the overall business. And so I think that becomes one of the key areas of opportunities, but also could be constraints as well, right? Because as those changes take place, the requirements change. And as the requirements change, you have to continue to make sure that your supply base is has the technical capabilities and competencies to be able to continue to meet the varying changes that take place in a specific area. also in our business, there is a very long incubation time before you get to actual supply. So the life cycle of product development is very long and significant. And so being a part of the development cycle ensures that you'll be a part of the product supply cycle. But when it takes, 6 to 8 years to get from ideation to implementation, that's a very long time for a supplier to be in that overall process. And so that becomes another part of the overall process that can be a challenge when you're looking at being able to build this pipeline of opportunity to be able to deliver on goals and objectives. For us, also being a heavily regulated entity as well, the regulations in and of themselves become barriers to entry, because once a product is registered with a specific supply-based chemistry, that's essentially what's been approved to supply. And so to be able to make changes is very difficult. Where the opportunities exist is for us to be able to take a strategic view at how we, what opportunities we have across our entire supply base and supply chain, and be very deliberate in terms of the areas we focus on, being able to ensure we have inclusion, diversity, and equity in areas where we know we can support it and drive it and win, while we look to build and develop in those areas where we know it takes much longer for us to be able to get entities in for a longer term sustainable relationship. And so it's a very interesting place to be in. For us, being a new company, right? All of this is under development for us. And our teams are working aggressively globally in terms of looking at those strategies. First and foremost, getting very clear on the baseline. And as you mentioned, we're spending a lot of time making sure that what the baseline reflects is what's real in the organization, so that we can then start to talk about what are the steps we need to take as relates to participation, development, to be able to drive and deliver on the longer term goals that we've set for the organization. But the barriers, of course, in an industry like ours are real, and we have to look at the ways that we create solutions around that, especially when you take a look at it on the regulatory side. And then the areas where it doesn't exist, those are the areas we have to challenge ourselves to drive hard, fast, and heavy to make sure we're creating those opportunities.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to shift over to Indrasen now. We all know that from a historical perspective, the inequality and of participation within our economy of Black businesses, it still remains evident because the structural and other challenges that exist within our economy is exacerbated by our historical past of exclusionary politics and practices and policies as a result of apartheid. So Indrasen, with you having been part of the SASDC when we were established and having a good understanding of our organizational purpose and mission, what do you think organizations such as ours can do to assist our corporates and our certified Black suppliers to overcome some of the barriers that you've observed, and maybe some of the barriers that Craig and his team will encounter going forward?
Thanks, Gary. Look, my view is that I think the South African Supplier Diversity Council, and we've mentioned the 5 Cs, firstly, are all very relevant to the SDGs. If anything, I think the fact that the SDGs are now a globally prominent ambition and multi-country, multi-geography does support and enhance what the SASDC is doing to a greater audience. Multinationals like Craig are now coming to South Africa or in South Africa, not only having to navigate a BBBEE, but also with SDGs. So it's a commonality, whereas previously BBBEE stood out as uniquely South African. And I therefore see an opportunity that's well towards advancing what the SASDC has been doing for the last 10 years. Secondly, I think if you look at goal number 17, Partnership for Goals, the SASDC is ideally positioned as a catalyst and a matchmaker, was the word we used back in the day, if I remember, in some of the events. So once again, goal number 17 is excellent positioning for the SASDC and the work that you do. And lastly, I'll keep it short because I'm mindful of time. I think the issue of supplier diversity and all of the other things that go with it happen on the court in business. And for it to happen on the court, workshops and the events that the SASDC run to capacitate and to give understanding and to bring people together continue to be a vital ingredient. I do think what has been introduced is new language, targets, indicators, etc. So that's the part that needs to be brought into the dialogue. And I know you've got plans, we've discussed it. So with that new language and new principles being brought into the picture, I think the SASDC is well positioned and very relevant to the SDGs being advanced in South Africa. Thank you, Gary.
We will definitely be taking on that baton and seeing what we can do to support that ecosystem and play our bit within that through the value addition. The last aspect of the theme and the themes that I've picked up is around key takeaways and advice. And Indrasen, you've already touched on a piece of advice to us as an organization. I'd like to ask Maja if she can share with us what do you think from a leadership and a culture perspective can organizations and especially supply chain leaders within organizations do more effectively to manage this change process that supply chain needs to embark upon, focusing on its role beyond just the profit, but also on the planet, the people, and the profit. So just some advice from your side. What do you think supply chain leaders can do more effectively to manage this change process?
Well, it sounds very simple, but it is not that easy to do. The best thing it would be for people as a collective to keep sitting together, now be it virtually or in a physical presence, which is always my preferred, and actually talking to each other, really naming what is going on, being able to reflect and to see what's happening internally, externally, what are the factual, what are emotional factors that are happening and influencing the results. So it's kind of being in a very regular and very productive conversation and building collective leadership capacity in which there is both centralized and decentralized capacities of both organizations and its units to find a way how to see and hear different perspectives, to engage as a collective in problem and defining and experimenting and finding the way how to address whatever the challenges they might be going along. So to keep the big blue sky positive, can do, it's all possible, we can do this perspective, and in the same time be willing to engage and name with the difficulties that do happen, rather than being all positive or all negative, just to be able to have a very open and constructive conversations. So that's what I'm saying. It's very simple. People sitting together and looking from different perspectives, naming it, and then collectively deciding how we're going to address that. Having said it's not that easy to do, but it really is what needs to be done. And then, all the different theoretical frameworks that can be there to help people grow their minds and their hearts in the ability to engage in a more constructive and ever widening way with each other and the world that they are part of.
Thanks, Maja. I'm mindful of time, and I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to make any comments or ask any questions. But before I cross over to that, and I really would like my panelists to try and be as brief as possible, 30 seconds, if possible. If we have a look at these, like I mentioned before, the historical exclusion of certain sectors of society, in the case of South Africa, Black South Africans, from participating freely in the mainstream economy, and the inequality across the world. Supply diversity is one of the means through which progressive buying firms are proactively bridging the gap, as we've heard Craig talk about it. And now the issue of sustainability and its impact on supply chain strategies and practices creates the risk of the existing gaps as a result of our historic past widening even further. So buying firms can do their bit to mitigate this and ensure that they are bringing new Black suppliers in the context of South Africa, minority suppliers in other parts of the world, along with them in this journey. But there's also a need for suppliers within their supply chain, or prospective suppliers from those groupings, to do their bit. It's a long context that I'm sketching, but Craig, in 30 seconds, what advice can you give to Black suppliers that are part of the audience of this webinar today?
For me, it would be reach out and engage and be a part of the solution. In many cases, you have defined already what you think the opportunity is. In some instances, let us help you define what that opportunity is. And so you have to bring yourself to the table and be very open to help us think through how collectively we can partner, which is a very different approach in terms of being able to create a win-win scenario from a partnership standpoint.
Thanks, Craig. Indrasen?
Hi, Gary. Sorry. Okay. My 30 seconds. 3 things. 1, future-proof your business and be alert to the changing landscape. 2, adopt a growth mindset on the possibilities that SDGs bring for business growth. And 3, collaborate for success, given that we are in a connected world. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, Maja?
Well, I'm just going to follow up because both Craig and Indrasen has already shared. Just open your minds, open your hearts, and connect with each other and with others and collaborate. So thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists and to all our participants today. We really value you attending this webinar. Over the coming months, we will share more with you our work and progress on our own strategy and SDG goals in the coming months. And we look forward to any other feedback that you would like to provide to us, as well as any other questions, information that you're looking for. We would gladly share that with you. And we hope that, and it seems from the comments that the participants have definitely found this a thought-provoking session, and certainly it seems to be the beginning of a conversation rather than the ending of one. So once again, thank you to everyone and have a wonderful day further.